There are roughly a dozen people visible in this black and white photograph, and in the center of it all, one enormous man is lifting another clean off the floor by the back of his collar. The man being lifted has his feet dangling inches above the ground, his face twisted into an expression somewhere between shock and pure disbelief. The crowd around him has frozen. One man in a tuxedo near the back has his hand pressed flat over his mouth, his eyes wide as dinner plates. A film camera stands idle in the background. Nobody is moving. Nobody is breathing. And the man responsible for all of it, the giant in the dark sweater, looks almost bored. What you are looking at is one of the most extraordinary unscripted moments in the history of Las Vegas entertainment. A moment that happened so fast, so unexpectedly, that even the people standing 3 feet away from it could barely process what their eyes were telling them. A moment that would ripple through Hollywood gossip circuits for decades, spoken about in hushed tones at dinner tables and dressing rooms from the Sands Hotel to the studios of Burbank. And the story behind it, the full story, the real story, is so much stranger and more emotionally complex than the image alone could ever suggest. Because this wasn't just a stunt. This wasn't a rehearsed bit for a TV special or a carefully staged publicity photograph. What happened in that room on that night involved 3 men who carried enormous weight in the American entertainment landscape. 3 men whose lives had intersected and diverged and intersected again in ways that most people never knew. 3 men who each harbored secrets about the other that the public never fully understood. And the moment the giant's hand closed around that collar and lifted, everything that had been building for years came pouring into a single, suspended second. To understand what really happened, you have to go back. You have to go back to the world these men came from, the world they built together, and the one night when the carefully constructed performance of friendship and professionalism cracked open just long enough to let the truth pour through. André René Roussimoff was born in a small town in France in 1946, and from the very beginning, his body was at war with the world around it. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already nearly 6 feet tall. By 17, he could not fit into the seats of local buses. The condition that defined his life, acromegaly, a disorder of the pituitary gland that caused relentless, uncontrollable growth, had already begun rewriting the architecture of his skeleton in ways that doctors of the era barely understood. He was not just large. He was architecturally impossible, a human being built on a scale that seemed to belong to a different species. And he had spent every single day of his life being reminded of it. What most people never understood about Andre was how desperately he wanted to be invisible. Not literally. Of course, you could not make a man who stood over 7 feet tall and weighed close to 500 pounds invisible. But inside, in the places that mattered most, Andre carried a longing to simply move through the world without being stared at, without being pointed at, without children running away or adults going quiet the moment he walked through a door. He had learned, through years of painful social education, to preempt that discomfort with humor. He became the comedian before anyone else could make him the punchline. He learned to laugh first, loudest, hardest, but there was something else underneath the laughter, something that the people who truly knew him could see in quiet moments. A loneliness so vast it was almost physical. A man who had everything and was missing everything. And when he arrived in Las Vegas in the early 1970s, when the world of professional wrestling was beginning to cross over into mainstream entertainment, Andre was not just looking for work. He was looking for something far more elusive than fame. He was looking for people who would look at him and see past the size. He found them in the most unexpected place. Sammy Davis Jr. had been famous longer than some people had been alive. Born in Harlem in 1925, the son of a vaudeville dancer, he had been performing professionally since he was old enough to walk. He had survived a car accident that cost him his left eye. He had navigated the savage racial politics of mid-century America with a grace that masked a fury so deep it had nowhere to go but inward. He had converted to Judaism, married a Swedish actress, defied every category society tried to put him in, and emerged from each collision with convention not broken but amplified. By the time the 1970s arrived, Sammy Davis Jr. was not just an entertainer. He was a force of nature wrapped in a tailored suit, a man who could sing, dance, act, do impressions, play drums, and command any room on earth the moment he stepped inside it. And yet, Sammy Davis Jr. carried a wound that never fully healed. For all his talent, for all his success, for all the standing ovations and the sold-out shows and the friendships with presidents, Sammy had spent his entire career fighting the quiet, grinding suspicion that he had to be twice as good as everyone else just to be considered half as valuable. He had fought that battle every single day and had won it over and over again. But winning a battle every day is exhausting. And exhaustion has a way of making even the strongest people vulnerable. Dean Martin was a different kind of creature entirely. If Sammy was fire and Andre was earth, then Dean was water. He moved through the world with a casualness so complete it was almost supernatural. Born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, in 1917, Dean had grown up in the kind of poverty that gives you either roots or wings, and somehow he had gotten both. His voice was the most comfortable voice in the world, a warm baritone that sounded like someone pouring good whiskey into a crystal glass at 10 in the evening when the day is finally over. He made everything look effortless because he worked extraordinarily hard to make it look effortless. That was the magic of Dean Martin, the craft behind the ease. But Dean had edges that his easy smile concealed. He had opinions that could cut. He had loyalties that ran deep and cold, like underground rivers. When Dean Martin loved you, he loved you in a way that was unspoken and absolute. And when something threatened the people he loved, Dean Martin became someone quite different from a man you saw on stage with a glass in his hand and a song in his throat. The three of them had orbited each other for years before that night. Sammy had been part of the Rat Pack, that legendary, mythologized constellation of talent and charisma that had burned so bright over Las Vegas in the early 1960s. Dean had been his gravitational center, even if Frank Sinatra held the official throne. Andre had crossed paths with the entertainment world through television appearances, through charity events, through the strange social ecosystem that Las Vegas had always been, where wrestlers and singers and comedians and card sharks all ended up at the same tables eventually. The city had a way of collapsing distances between people that the outside world kept carefully separated. By the early 1970s, the specific evening in question, Dean Martin was taping his television variety show, one of the most successful programs on American television. The Dean Martin Show was a masterpiece of constructed spontaneity. It was designed to look unrehearsed, to feel like a party you had wandered into rather than a performance you had been invited to watch. Guests would appear to drop by casually. Conversations would seem to happen in real time. Jokes would land as if they had just occurred to someone. None of it was accidental. All of it was the result of careful, precise production work. And Dean himself was the architect of that atmosphere, the man who set the temperature of the room the moment he walked in. That night, Andre the Giant was one of the guests. It had been arranged through channels that moved with a particular ease of things happening in Las Vegas at the height of its golden age, where a phone call between the right two people could put the most unlikely combination of human beings in the same room before the evening was out. Andre had done television before. He understood performance. He understood that the camera required a different version of yourself than the wrestling ring did. But he was also, underneath everything, still a young man from a small French town who found himself in a world of extraordinary glamour and was doing his level best to navigate it without breaking anything. Sammy Davis Jr. was also on the bill that evening. And this is where the story begins to gather speed. Because what almost nobody outside that studio knew was that the relationship between Sammy and Andre had a history that the cameras had never captured. They had met the previous year at an event in Los Angeles, a benefit performance where the backstage area had been crowded with the particular electricity that comes from putting famous people in close quarters. Andre had been standing in a corner, doing what he always did at such events, trying to take up as little space as possible while simultaneously occupying more space than anyone else in the room. Sammy had walked straight up to him, not cautiously, not with the careful, studied casualness that people tended to adopt around Andre. He had walked up to him the way Sammy walked into every room in his life, as if the room had been waiting for him specifically and was now complete. He had looked up at Andre with that extraordinary gaze that performers develop, a gaze that takes in everything while revealing nothing, and it said, simply, "Brother, you are the most beautiful, impossible thing I have ever seen." Andre had laughed. A real laugh, not a performance laugh. And something had shifted between them. They had spent 2 hours talking that night in Los Angeles about growing up different, about being on stage from childhood and never knowing what it felt like to be anonymous, about the specific loneliness of being famous for something you were born with rather than something you made. Andre had said something that Sammy would repeat to close friends for years afterward. He had said, "You know what the difference is between us? You can take off the costume." And Sammy had gone quiet in a way that many understood exactly what was meant. So when they arrived at the Dean Martin taping that evening, there was already a current between them that the other people in the studio could feel, but not name, a frequency of mutual recognition. And there was also, underneath that warmth, a tension, because something had happened in the weeks between that Los Angeles evening and this night in Las Vegas. Something that had not been resolved. Something that one of them had done, or said, or failed to say that had left a fracture running through the friendship. The exact nature of that fracture is something that various people who were present that evening have described differently over the years. What everyone agrees on is that there had been a situation involving a promotional appearance, a public event where Andre had been used as what he would later describe as a prop, positioned and photographed in a way that reduced him to his physicality, without any acknowledgement of anything else. And there were people who had arranged that situation. People who had been in the room when the decision was made. People who had not spoken up when they perhaps should have. Sammy had been one of those people. Whether it was cowardice or oversight or the particular blindness that comes from being so accustomed to the machinery of show business that you stop seeing the human beings inside it. Sammy had not said what needed to be said, and Andre knew. Andre had not confronted him directly, but Andre knew. The evening began normally. Television tapings have their own rhythm, their own bureaucratic momentum that carries people along regardless of whatever personal undercurrents might be running beneath the surface. Lights are set. Positions are marked with tape on the floor. Producers move through the space with clipboards and the particular expression of people who are perpetually 10 minutes behind where they need to be. Dean held court in the center of it all with the magnificent ease of a man in his natural element, cracking jokes, remembering the names of crew members, making everyone feel like the party had already started. The first segment went smoothly. Dean sang. There was a comedy sketch. The audience laughed in the right places. Andre had been introduced to the audience with the kind of theatrical fanfare that always accompanied him. The announcer's voice dropping an octave, the dramatic pause before the curtain moved, the collective intake of breath from the audience when they saw him in person for the first time. Andre had played it beautifully, doing the self-deprecating gentle giant routine that he had perfected over years, bending his enormous frame slightly as if trying to make himself smaller, setting the audience at ease with the precision of a man who had been doing it his entire life. But during the break between segments, in that backstage corridor where the cameras didn't go and the microphones were off, something shifted. The precise sequence of events has been pieced together from the accounts of multiple witnesses over the years, accounts given in interviews and memoirs and late-night conversations with journalists who understood they were being trusted with something rare. What appears to have happened is this. Sammy made a joke. It was the kind of joke that Sammy was famous for, quick and layered, containing within a reference that most people in the room would not have caught. But Andre caught it. And what Andre heard in that joke was not what Sammy intended. Or perhaps it was exactly what Sammy intended, and Sammy had not realized until the moment it left his mouth that it was the wrong thing to say. The joke touched, with the careless precision of a thrown stone hitting, exactly the wrong window, on the promotional appearance, on being used, on the question of what Andre was to people in this industry. The room had one of those peculiar moments of total silence that only happen when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The kind of silence where you can hear the air conditioning, where everyone very carefully does not look at the person they most want to look at. And then Andre moved. He moved the way large things move when they're no longer trying to be careful about their size. He crossed the space between himself and Sammy in 2 steps. Sammy was a small man, dynamic and physically gifted but small, perhaps 5'5" in shoes, and Andre at his full height made him look like a child, without a word, with an expression on his face that witnesses would later describe variously as fury and grief, and something unnameable that combined both. Andre reached out and took hold of the back of Sammy's collar, and he lifted him, not violently, Not in the way you would lift something you want to destroy, but absolutely, with a completeness that left no room for argument or negotiation. Sammy's feet left the floor. His body swung slightly like a pendulum finding its equilibrium. His face, that expressive, extraordinary face that had communicated to audiences in 1,000 cities, on 1,000 stages, every emotion a human heart could contain, went through 3 separate expressions in the space of half a second. Surprise, recognition, and then something that people who witnessed it found difficult to categorize. Something almost like relief. Dean Martin, who had been standing perhaps 15 feet away, turned around at the sound of the silence, and what he saw stopped him completely. A man who was almost never stopped completely. A man who moved through even the most chaotic situations with the unhurried certainty of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by almost nothing. Dean Martin stood there with a glass in his hand that he had raised halfway toward his mouth and forgotten to lower, and he looked at what was happening in front of him, and his face did something that the people who were watching him said they had never seen it do before. He smiled, not a stage smile, not the press photograph smile, or the here comes the punchline smile. Something realer than all of that, something that contained, in a particular curve and warmth, the response of a man who has just seen the truth arrive in an unexpected form. He set his glass down on the nearest surface. He straightened his jacket. He walked across the room. And he did the last thing anyone expected him to do. He started talking. Not to Andre, not to the room, to Sammy. He started talking to Sammy in a quiet, conversational voice. The way you talk to someone when you're saying something that is meant for them alone, and the room around you has ceased to exist. And the words he said, according to the people close enough to hear them, were both simpler and more devastating than any punchline or any dramatic monologue could have been. You know what he's telling you. Dean said, you've known for 2 weeks. Sammy looked at him. Sammy's feet were still off the ground. This is important. He was still suspended, held there by the quiet insistence of a man who had decided that the performance was over, and looking at Dean with Andre's enormous hand still closed around his collar. Sammy's face changed for the last time that evening. The showman disappeared. The carefully constructed public persona, the one that had been built over 50 years of performance and survival, went somewhere else. And what was left was just a man, a tired man who had done something wrong and had been waiting, maybe without fully knowing he was waiting, to be called on it. Yeah, Sammy said. I know. Andre set him down, not abruptly, not dismissively, with a care that was almost tender. He placed Sammy's feet back on the floor, the way you set down something valuable that you are not sure you have the right to put down yet. And then he stood there, the two of them, eye to eye in the only meaningful sense of phrase, because their eyes were nowhere near the same height, and the room held its breath. What happened next is the part that very few people know, because the cameras did come back on. The taping resumed. Dean Martin cracked a joke that had nothing to do with anything that had just occurred. A joke so perfectly calibrated to dissolve the remaining tension in the room that it functioned like a key in a lock, and the laughter that followed was real. The kind of real laughter that comes from the release of held breath, from the relief of a room that was bracing for something terrible and found something human instead. But in the commercial break that followed the next segment, Sammy and Andre stood together in the corner near the camera equipment, not talking, just standing. And the people who saw them said that something had been renegotiated between them in that silence, that the whole complex architecture of their friendship, the thing that had been built in Los Angeles and cracked in the weeks since, was being quietly reassembled. Not perfectly. The crack would always be there. But the thing itself, the real thing, the thing underneath the performances and the public smiles and the careful management of how you present yourself to the world, that thing was still standing. Dean never spoke publicly about what happened that evening. He was asked about it exactly once, in an interview several years later, and his answer was a masterclass in the art of saying everything while appearing to say nothing. He said only, sometimes the best thing a friend can do is let the other guy handle it. And then he winked. And then he changed the subject with such fluid expertise that the interviewer didn't realize for several seconds that the subject had been changed. But there is more to this story, because the moment itself, as extraordinary as it was, is only the surface of something deeper, something that has to do with what these 3 men represented in the world they inhabited, what they represented to each other, and what the particular alchemy of that evening ultimately produced. Andre the Giant spent his career in an industry that asked him to be a monster. That was the business he was in. Professional wrestling needed him to be enormous and threatening and barely human, and he was good enough at performing that role that it made him famous across the world. But the performance had a cost. Every time he stepped into that role, every time he played the thing that frightened people rather than the person who felt things, he was reinforcing the wall between himself and the ordinary human experience he had wanted since childhood. He was making himself legendary and making himself lonelier in the same motion. Sammy Davis Jr. spent his career in an industry that asked him to be exceptional in order to be acceptable. The racism that defined his world was not the crude, overt kind alone, though there was plenty of that. It was also the subtler kind, the kind that says we will celebrate you, we will put you on every stage we have, we will tell the world you are extraordinary, and in exchange you will never ask for the ordinary things. You will never ask to be mediocre and still welcome. You will never ask to make a mistake and have it be forgotten rather than cataloged. You'll perform your way to belonging, and you will do it every single day, because the moment you stop, the belonging stops with it. Both of them knew what it was to carry a weight that was not of their making. Both of them knew what it was to be seen as a symbol before you were seen as a person. And the moment in that corridor, the moment when Andre's hand closed around Sammy's collar and lifted, was not just about a joke or a promotional appearance or a failure of solidarity. It was about all of it. It was about every time the machinery had moved without anyone asking whether the person inside it was all right. It was about what happens when the accumulated weight of being used finally finds a moment when it cannot be politely set aside anymore. And Dean Martin, who understood both men perhaps better than they understood themselves, who had spent 40 years watching the entertainment industry chew up human beings and spit out commodities, who had his own scars and his own carefully concealed grief about the world he lived in, Dean Martin had done the only thing that could have been done in that moment. He had let the truth move through the room. Without trying to manage it, he had stayed present. And when it was time to speak, he had spoken the one sentence that cut through everything and named what was actually happening. That is a rarer gift than it sounds. Most people, when confronted with a scene like the one in that corridor, would have moved to defuse it, would have made a joke or changed the subject or physically inserted themselves between the two parties to prevent escalation. Most people are afraid of the truth when it arrives in its raw form, when it has not been packaged and sanded down into something comfortable. Dean was not afraid. Dean had looked at what was happening and recognized it for what it was, a reckoning that needed to happen, and he had facilitated it with the quiet skill of a man who understood that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for people you love is to let them tell each other the truth. The television taping concluded that evening as if nothing unusual had occurred. The audience went home. The crew packed up the equipment. The lights came down. And the three men who had just participated in one of the most quietly extraordinary moments of their shared lives went their separate ways into the Las Vegas night with the particular lightness of people who have passed through something difficult and come out the other side still standing. In the years that followed, the friendship between Andre and Sammy became one of the more unlikely and quietly celebrated connections in the entertainment world. They appeared together on several occasions. They were photographed at parties and premieres and charitable events, always with that particular ease that exists between people who have shown each other something true and survived the showing. People who knew them well noted that Sammy could make Andre laugh in a way that very few people could, a real laugh, the underground laugh that comes from someplace deeper than performance. And Andre, in the rare interviews where he spoke about his personal life rather than his wrestling career, always described Sammy with a specific warmth that he reserved for very few people. What Sammy had done wrong that evening in the corridor, he made right, not dramatically, not with a public statement or a grand gesture. He made it right the way people actually make things right, in the small accumulated moments of showing up differently than you showed up before, of being present in a way that you were not present before, of letting someone's full humanity take up space without trying to manage it or contain it or use it for your own purposes. Andre never spoke publicly about what happened that night. He was a private man in the ways that mattered, despite spending his life in public. But there is a story that circulates among people who are close to him, a story that has the quality of something true, even though it cannot be verified, about a night several years later when Sammy was going through a difficult period, one of the darker valleys of a life that had several of them, and Andre, who was on the other side of the country, called him, not to talk about anything in particular, not to check in with any agenda, just to call, to make the phone ring, to remind a person who had spent his whole life performing for other people that someone was thinking of him when the cameras were off and the stage was dark and there was nothing to perform and nowhere to be magnificent. Dean Martin outlived both of them. He lost his son in a plane crash in 1987 and withdrew from the world in a way that people who loved him found heartbreaking to witness. The easy warmth that had defined him publicly became something more interior, more guarded. He was still Dean Martin, still the same voice and the same face and the same quality of presence, but the performance had stopped. He wasn't performing ease anymore. He was just living in the quiet. And maybe that was its own kind of peace, or maybe it was something more complicated than peace. The people who knew him in those final years said he talked about his friends differently than he had before, with a directness that was new, as if the things he had always known but never said out loud needed saying now. While there was still time to say them, he talked about Sammy, about a particular quality of courage that he said he had never fully named while Sammy was alive and wished he had, about the way Sammy had moved through a world that did not always want to make room for him, and had made room anyway, not by making himself smaller, but by expanding into every available space with such generosity that the world eventually had to accommodate him. He never let them win. Dean said once, in a conversation that was repeated by the person who heard it, every single day, they tried to make him feel like less, and every single day he showed up and was more. I don't know where he got it from. I don't know if I could have done it. And he talked about Andre, about an evening in Las Vegas that he described, with the precision of a man choosing his words carefully, as one of the most honest things he had ever witnessed. He said that Andre had done something that night that he himself had not had the courage to do in 40 years of friendships, that Andre had said with his body what nobody had been willing to say with words, and that Sammy, to his enormous credit, had understood immediately what was being said and had not flinched from it. The big man told the truth, Dean said, and the little man heard it. That doesn't happen as often as it should. There is a photograph from the Dean Martin taping that evening. Not the famous one. Not the one that shows Andre's hand close around Sammy's collar with everyone else frozen in the background. There is another photograph, taken moments later or moments before, depending on which witnesses you believe, that shows all three of them standing together, Andre and Sammy and Dean. Andre is bent slightly at the waist in that characteristic posture of his. The physical consideration he showed to the people around him, not shrinking himself, but folding slightly toward the human scale of the room. Sammy is looking up at him with an expression that is almost impossible to categorize, something between laughter and apology and something warmer than either. And Dean has his arm around both of them, or as close to both of them as one arm can get when one of the people it is reaching for is 7 feet tall, and his face carries the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. That photograph has never been widely circulated. It lives in archives and private collections, and the memories of people who were there that evening. But the people who have seen it say that it captures something about those three men that none of the famous photographs, the stage ones, the promotional ones, the ones taken on red carpets and television stages and at award ceremonies, none of those capture. It captures them as people, just people, standing together in a room, having been through something true together and still standing. The entertainment industry moves fast. It always has. It consumes its participants with an efficiency that is almost mechanical, extracting what it needs and setting aside what it cannot use. And the people who survive it, the ones who come out the other end still recognizing themselves, are the ones who found, somewhere along the way, connections that existed outside the machinery. Friendships that were not about what you could do for each other professionally. Relationships built on something the cameras could not see and the publicity departments could not manage. Andre the Giant found that, in pieces, in fragments, in the corners of a career that was mostly about spectacle. He found it in the people who looked at him and saw past the size, who engaged with the person rather than the phenomenon. And what happened that evening in the corridor of the Dean Martin show, as strange and sudden and theatrically improbable as it was one of those moments, a moment of pure, unmanaged human truth, happening in the middle of a very managed human enterprise. Sammy Davis Jr. died in 1990. Andre the Giant died in 1993. Dean Martin died in 1995. 3 men, gone within 5 years of each other, taken within the full and private weight of what they knew about themselves and each other and the world they had moved through together. What remains are performances, the recordings, the photographs, and the stories. The stories that pass from mouth to ear in a particular way that true things travel, slowly and carefully, finding their way to people who will take care of them. But there are other things that remain, intangible things, the shape of what those 3 men were to each other, the particular frequency of recognition that passed between them in the spaces where the cameras couldn't go. The fact that a man who had spent his entire life being reduced to his size found, at least once, someone willing to be made fully accountable for that reduction. The fact that the person willing to be accountable had the courage to hear the truth when it came in the most unexpected possible form. The fact that a 3rd man, watching all of it, understood exactly what he was witnessing and chose to honor it rather than defuse it. These are not small things. These are the things that define what people actually are to each other, beneath the performances and the personas and the carefully maintained public images. These are the things that make a friendship real. The image endures. That frozen moment in the black and white photograph. Andre's enormous hand closed around Sammy's collar. Sammy's feet off the ground. The crowd frozen in the background. Dean's hand pressed over his mouth. It looks at first glance like chaos, like something going wrong. But knowing what you now know, knowing the history and the fracture and the reckoning, and what came after, look at it again. Look at Dean's eyes. Look at the way Andre is holding on, not with aggression but with insistence. Look at Sammy's face, that extraordinary face with its 50 years of performance and survival, and tell me that what you see there is fear. It isn't fear, it's recognition. It's the face of a man who has been truly seen, perhaps for the first time in a long time, and is deciding in real time whether to run from it or receive it. And in the next frame, in the moment a photograph does not capture, Sammy Davis Jr. made his choice. He stayed. He heard it. He let himself be set down. And the 3 of them stood together in a room in Las Vegas, in a moment that the world almost didn't see, and were briefly completely just themselves. That is what happened that night. That is the real story. Not the spectacle of the lift, not the shock of the moment, not even the extraordinary physical fact of a 7-foot man suspending a legend of American entertainment in midair in the middle of a television studio in 1970s Las Vegas. The real story is what was said without words, what was heard without explanation, and what 3 men chose to do with the truth once it had finally been allowed into the room. The lights went down. The cameras went cold. Las Vegas kept spinning outside, indifferent and eternal, doing what it has always done, burning in the dark at the edge of the desert, keeping its secrets. But in that studio, in that corridor, something true had happened. And the truth, once it has been spoken, even in the wordless language of a man lifting another man off the ground and holding him there until someone else says what needs to be said, the truth does not go back to where it came from. It stays. It changes things. And sometimes, when the people involved are large enough in soul to meet it, it makes things better than they were before. Remember that the next time you see something that looks like chaos, the next time you witness something that doesn't make sense on its surface, that seems too strange to be anything but an accident or a mistake or a breakdown, look closer. Look at the faces. Look at the man watching from 15 feet away with his hand frozen halfway to his mouth and something true moving across his face. Look at what's happening underneath the spectacle. Because sometimes the most honest thing in the room is the thing nobody planned. Sometimes the truth needs a giant to carry it.